Welcome to Rookie Aspirant. Today's explainer explores a fascinating, albeit pretty alarming, chain reaction. We're looking at how a distant geopolitical clash, specifically the 2026 US-Iran conflict, creates this massive economic shockwave that literally travels thousands of miles to hit the Indian economy. It's like a giant row of dominoes falling, and we're going to look at the data to figure out exactly how these global events are so deeply connected to everyday life.
Think about it for a second. How does a war that's 1,500 miles away actually crash your local economy? How does a military standoff in the Middle East translate to the price of your groceries, the value of your currency, and even the stability of your job market?
Well, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the 2026 Gulf conflict. Second, the Hormuz oil choke point. Third, India's economic blast radius. Fourth, 3 timelines of economic impact. And finally, policy defenses and survival.
Okay, let's jump right in. Section 1, the 2026 Gulf conflict, the geopolitical epicenter.
If you just mentally map this out, you'll see exactly why this matters so much. We have the US and Iran military conflict zone right there in the Persian Gulf. Just below that, you've got the critical Strait of Hormuz shipping route, and directly across the Arabian Sea, sitting highly exposed, is India. These shipping routes are the arteries of the global economy, and right now, they're under severe threat.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Hormuz oil choke point, the transmission mechanism.
Get this. A staggering 25 to 30% of the world's oil and 20% of its liquefied natural gas transits right through the Strait of Hormuz. We're seeing active efforts by Iranian forces to control this strait, while U.S. Central Command is conducting military operations to keep it open. Any closure here, actually, scratch that. Even just the threat of a closure that forces ships to reroute triggers what analysts are calling the largest disruption to the global oil market in history.
So, let's move to Section 3, India's economic blast radius, zooming in on the victim. India relies on the Gulf for roughly 85 to 90% of its crude oil and about half of its natural gas. When you're that dependent on one single geographic region for the energy that literally powers your entire nation, you are incredibly exposed.
The immediate result is this brutal collision between India's unyielding domestic energy demands and a sudden, violent cutoff in the global supply chain. You obviously can't just turn off the energy needs of over 1 billion people. But when supply is suddenly restricted, prices surge, and that extra cost basically bleeds straight out of the domestic economy and into the pockets of foreign oil producers.
Let's look at Section 4, 3 timelines of economic impact, escalating severity.
Researchers have actually run Monte Carlo simulations on this and divided the potential fallout into 3 distinct horizons. You have a short-run shock lasting under 3 months, a medium run lasting up to 6 months, and a completely devastating long-run scenario where the conflict exceeds a year. The length of the war entirely dictates the severity of the economic fallout.
Let's unpack this data goldmine, because this is where the macroeconomic rubber really meets the road. If the conflict is short, oil spikes to $105 and growth dips just a bit. But look at that long-term scenario. If the conflict lasts over a year, oil hits a massive $140 a barrel. This crashes India's projected GDP growth down to 5% and skyrockets inflation to a really painful 9%. That means absolutely everything costs more, while the economy as a whole is generating less wealth.
And the data reveals that these negative macroeconomic shocks amplify dramatically over time. It's a nonlinear threshold effect. Initially, sure, the government can absorb the cost. But as the conflict drags on, the Indian rupee weakens by 10 to 15%, the current account deficit widens to 3% of GDP, and the fiscal deficit just balloons as the government desperately tries to subsidize fuel and fertilizer to keep the country running. But wait, it's not just about oil. The shock wave includes severe secondary impacts. There are 9.1 million Indians working in the Gulf sending home $50 billion in remittances. A war risks their jobs and that vital income stream entirely. On top of that, shipping insurance costs absolutely skyrocket, and there's a rapid flight of capital from panicking foreign investors. Reports already noted a $12.1 billion net equity sell-off in just the early days of the conflict. We're also seeing severe delays in fertilizer imports, about 1/3 of which go through Hormuz, which directly threatens agricultural output.
Okay, so what can be done? Section 5, Policy Defenses and Survival, the SHIELD.
Researchers suggest a phased approach to fight this.
The immediate first steps require the Reserve Bank of India tapping foreign exchange reserves to defend the currency and the government deploying strategic petroleum reserves to temporarily cap fuel prices. But in the long term, survival mandates a major structural shift. India absolutely must accelerate the diversification of its energy sources away from the Strait of Hormuz. We're talking tapping US and African markets, massively increasing renewables, and finding alternative logistics routes.
Which brings us to the ultimate question. We want to leave you with this final thought. Can an emerging economy ever truly be independent in a globalized world? Or are we forever tied to distant conflicts? When an incident 1,500 miles away can literally dictate your nation's inflation rate, it definitely forces us to rethink what economic security really means. Subscribe for more such content.